Let's take a look at the policy framework for Zscaler Internet Access. So as we go through this, it's important to understand the order of operation as a packet flows through the service edge. So the tunnel from the client is terminated on the service edge and will identify traffic as being HTTP or HTTPS to flow through the proxy engine at the top. All other traffic will be passed through the basic firewall, which may identify HTTP and HTTPS traffic based on port, or the advanced firewall, which will identify HTTP and HTTPS based on deep packet inspection and looking at that header information. Traffic can then flow that's identified as HTTP or HTTPS up to the proxy modules. All other traffic passes through the firewall policy, the NAT control policy and IPS policy before passing through bandwidth control and egressing out to the internet. And of course, return traffic flows through the same modules on the way back. Any traffic that's then identified as HTTP or HTTPS will pass through the proxy module and have the TLS inspection policy applied based on OCSP, the certificate validity information, and the URL policy for inspection. Traffic then will pass through the file type control, the browser control, and the data loss prevention, where we'll look at the payload and understand, is it breaking any of the data loss prevention rules, in which case it may be blocked. Also pass through the sandbox policy. Traffic will then egress out through the firewall, where we'll do NAT and IPS control before passing out to the internet. And then on the response, the traffic comes back through the same modules. We'll pass it through dynamic content classification, where looking at the payload and the request and the response, we may decide to recategorize the website based on any of that information. The URL policy applies on the way back as well. Content, the payload is passed through the antivirus, advanced threat protection, the file type control, again looking at the response data, again look at the browser control information, data loss prevention on the way back in, and making a sandbox policy decision where we may pass the file to the sandbox to be detonated and exploded and understand the payload and what it's doing for zero-day vulnerability. And based on policy, the user may get a quarantine notification that the file needs to be inspected before the user is allowed to download it. Then passes back through the URL policy to the TLS proxy, where the TLS proxy will re-encrypt using that man-in-the-middle certificate back to the client. So there are multiple resources that we should consider that need to be used in policy. Some of these are already predefined, but you may look at things like within the access control module, URL categories, where you can define custom categories or override existing categories. If you're going to do bandwidth management, then you're going to look at bandwidth classes, where you're going to map categories to classes and apply those within your bandwidth management policy. You may also define time intervals for policy to apply. So a time interval might be Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, where you might have a more restrictive policy. And then you might create rule labels where when you create your rules, you'll apply a label so they're easily identifiable. For data loss prevention, you're going to define your dictionaries and engines, a dictionary being a definition of matches, for example, regular expressions or matching credit card numbers, and then mapping a dictionary to an engine which applies to the rules. So an engine might map social security number, credit card number together to make a PII match. Within firewall filtering, we have our network service definitions. What are our layer 4 TCP, UDP port definitions, and grouping those together. You can add or amend existing rules. Within network applications, we've got our layer 7 or DPI definitions and groups, and you may create additional groups and definitions there. IP and FQDN are source IP, destination IP, as well as FQDN and wildcards that you can then apply within your firewall policy. And there are also application services which can't be updated but show you the Zscaler managed services, for example, the M365 definitions. For traffic forwarding, we have a couple of different modules to look at. Proxies and gateways are upstream proxies that we might need to forward traffic to. There is also the Zscaler private access definitions, which are ZPA application segments that you may forward to based on traffic rules, for example, for source IP anchoring. And then location management are the definitions of the static IP addresses and names and GRE tunnels that you want to apply for policy and bandwidth management rules.